When it comes to the world of ice and fire, there are a few beasts that inspire as much fear and awe as dragons. Dragons are fire-made flesh. Their unstoppable power allowed the Valyrians to conquer and subjugate most of Essos for centuries, and enabled the Targaryens to conquer and subjugate the Seven Kingdoms for centuries after that. However, after revolutionizing most of Planetos in blazes of glory and terror, instead of this species flourishing or even going out with a bang, they went out with a whimper. Barely 100 years after the Targaryens united the kingdoms of Westeros and named themselves kings and queens from the backs of seemingly unstoppable dragons, the few dragons that even hatched wound up being sad remnants of this once titanic species. And the Targaryens, along with the fans and viewers of the series, were left asking themselves, why? After all, while the number of dragons that were left in the world were already dwindling rapidly, the fact that the dragons that survived the doom of Valyria went from beasts that could destroy the world to small, sad imitations of the fearsome animals that they once were in the matter of a few generations would indicate that something had gone very wrong with them very quickly. While dragons are hardly normal animals, if any living species in the real world went from relatively normal to barely able to reproduce and only able to spawn extremely unhealthy and stunted offspring, people would be rightfully alarmed. Yes, the gene pool of the remaining dragons was distressingly small already, but even so, one would think that a species on the verge of extinction like that would still peter out rather than almost instantaneously collapse. Understandably, fans have many theories about what happened to the dragons, or more specifically, who made what happened to them happen. And unfortunately for House Targaryen, the list of suspects isn't exactly small. Dragons are the most dangerous weapons in the world. They allowed the Valyrians to become the most powerful civilization in the world, and allowed just 3 Targaryens to invade and conquer an entire continent. They seem to be the foundation on which Valyrian power was built, and everyone who could control dragons could in turn control everything and anything that they wanted to. House Targaryen ultimately became the most powerful family in the world, and they never made a habit of sharing their power. When they conquered Westeros, they were extremely reluctant to marry any Westerosi families into their own, and they certainly weren't keen on letting any non-Targaryens gain access to their literal firepower. But what that means is that, although there are certain people who are more suspicious than others, literally every non-Targaryen in Westeros likely wanted to see the reign of dragons come to an end. But although the list of suspects should be about as long as a census of the Seven Kingdoms, most theorize that it was either the Faith of the Seven or the Maesters who were the masterminds behind the destruction of the dragons. And they certainly make sense as prime suspects, given that they are 2 of the largest and most powerful organizations in Westeros that have access to anything and everything, including the Targaryens themselves. There are more reasons to suspect these organizations as well. Just as with every powerful family or group in Westeros, when the Targaryens arrived in the Seven Kingdoms, the power that they took diminished the power of the people who had already existed there. It's clear that the subjugation of the kingdoms was not willing on the part of its citizens, so they would likely feel quite motivated to take some of that power back. And given that the Maesters were one of the only organizations that wielded power across every kingdom, it makes sense that they would want to undermine the rule of the Targaryens. And beyond that, the Maesters in particular have very little love for magic in general. Despite seemingly believing in magic and even offering study in the subject, they seem to have a keen interest in ensuring that others don't believe in magic. And they also seem to take certain steps to prevent magic from returning in the contemporary timeline of the story. And of course, arguably the biggest reason why the Maesters are the prime suspects is because Archmaester Marwyn the Mage seems to outright state that it was the Maesters who killed off the dragons. That would seemingly end the question of how the dragons all died. Except, does it really? Yes, Marwyn claims that the Maesters were the ones that did it. However, in the history of A Song of Ice and Fire, it seems that more often than not, those who claim to do something extraordinary are lying. But if it wasn't the Maesters, or the Faith, or some diabolical or politically savvy house in Westeros, then who or what was it? Well, perhaps people are looking for conspiracy theories where none exist. Maybe the dragons truly did just die on their own. Now, this would seem like a fairly outrageous and extremely convenient idea given the circumstances. Because again, any species going from a dwindling number of relatively normal animals to being unable to produce anything but stunted and malformed creatures seems exceptionally unlikely. However, dragons are not relatively normal animals. To understand the end of the dragons, it's best to start from the beginning. As creatures that are both mythical and real, there are unsurprisingly a lot of origin myths surrounding where the dragons truly came from. Some say that they came from the Shadowlands of Ashai. Some say that they came from a second moon that cracked like an egg and let all the dragons out. However, given that their entire empire was built on the backs of dragons, it seems like what the Valyrians say about where the dragons came from may be the most relevant. According to the Valyrians, the dragons sprang forth from the 14 Flames, the chain of volcanoes that served as the steam engine that fueled the Valyrian Empire itself. However, this origin story is a strange one. After all, the Doom of Valyria appears to have been some sort of massive explosion of the 14 Flames, one that was so large that it even killed the dragons. But if the dragons originated from the 14 Flames themselves, then how would not one of them have survived the Doom? But perhaps this origin story is both true and false. Septon Barth, hand of the king to Jaehaerys Targaryen, has some very interesting theories regarding how the Valyrians came to control and very possibly create the dragons themselves. The Valyrians were quite fond of experimenting with magically and biologically blending different creatures anyway, and it's hard not to notice that if a fireworm and a wyvern were thrown into a blender, something like a dragon would seemingly come out of it. Interestingly, one of the strongest indications of dragons possibly not being an animal that naturally occurs in the world comes from the Targaryen invasion of Westeros. Westeros is not a land that seems to be home to a lot of fire magic, but it does seem to be a bit of a hotbed of magic in general. And while abilities like skin changing and warging are extraordinary powers, they're not a particularly uncommon power. Dragons represent the greatest power that the world has ever known, and the Targaryens invaded a land where there are seemingly hundreds of people who can take possession of an animal with their minds. So it seems incredibly, astoundingly strange that there are no reports of anyone ever skin changing or even attempting to skin change into a dragon. Granted, it would likely be incredibly difficult, and perhaps there is some other explanation for why no one has ever done it before. But even putting the appeal of dragon power aside, once everyone saw what an existential threat dragons were to Westeros, it seems unlikely that no skin changer ever even thought to try to wrest that total control that House Targaryen had over the country away from them. And even putting the skin changing issue aside, contrary to what the TV series would have everyone believe, the dragons will not be going beyond the wall anytime soon. In fact, the wall seems to be some sort of natural repellent to the dragons, which is another extremely strange indication that there is something very abnormal about the dragons themselves. After all, the wall wasn't even built with the dragons in mind. And the wall is an extremely powerful magical barrier, but as the direwolves that the Starks find at the beginning of the story seem to indicate, it's not a barrier that keeps magical creatures away. One might assume that it was a barrier to keep ice magic at bay, but the dragons being repelled by it would indicate otherwise as well. It's possible that Bran the Builder was just exceptionally prescient and imbued the wall with magic that would serve as a barrier to something that would threaten Westeros in the future, but it seems far more likely that the wall was built as a barrier to keep all unnatural magic out. And honestly, the theory that dragons are unnatural magical creations would answer a lot of questions about dragons in general, like why it was that the Valyrians were the only civilization that could control them, why the rise of Valyria seemed to coincide with the sudden proliferation of dragons that was localized to solely this area of Planetos, and why the Doom of Valyria seemed to translate to the Doom of Dragons themselves. There seems to be more background information that supports this theory as well. While the Valyrian civilization is mostly gone from the world, their civilization seems to be built almost entirely on fire magic, and fire magic in general is certainly alive and well in Planetos. The followers of R'hllor seem to be the most powerful human magic wielders in the series thus far, and their magic seems to be almost entirely fueled by fire and ritual sacrifice. But it's hard not to notice that their power seems to require a lot of ritual sacrifice. There's a very clear through line connecting blood with magic in the world of Ice and Fire, but from what we know about the history of Valyria, as well as what we know about fire magic users that exist today, it seems like fire magic is extremely consumptive. In the Valyrian freehold, slaves were dying constantly, many of them dying by fire in and around the 14 Flames themselves. And while the information regarding the advanced Valyrian technology like Valyrian stone and Valyrian steel is lost, there's a lot of subtextual hints that they also involved blood magic. And in the contemporary storyline, there are a lot of fire magic users who are doing some spectacularly impressive things, but they are killing an astounding number of people in order to do it. And this concept, the idea that the most powerful magic in the world requires the most sacrifice, seems to hold up within the rest of the universe as well. Ice is clearly meant to be the magical counterpart to fire, and given that the army of the dead literally requires thousands upon thousands of dead people, it seems like there's a clear indication that great power comes from great sacrifice. So then, if dragons are truly creatures that do not occur in nature and were somehow created through fire and blood magic, it would make sense that the sustenance of the dragons as a species would be dependent on the continuation of that blood sacrifice. And this idea seems to have already been confirmed in A Song of Ice and Fire itself. Daenerys is in possession of her dragon eggs for quite a while, and she seems to have an instinctive understanding that she will be able to hatch them, but she then comes to realize that hatching them would require some sort of blood sacrifice as well. When Daenerys actually does this, dragons are finally brought back into the world. So, while there are plenty of potential suspects when it comes to the destruction of the dragon race, it actually seems incredibly likely that these magical beings simply couldn't survive without the enormous blood sacrifices that it took to create them in the first place.